Shalom. Here in the land of Israel, we've reached the penultimate Torah portion in the book of Leviticus. This week we are reading the Torah portion of Behar. And the instructions and details relating to the service of the temple offerings have concluded. And now the nation of Israel is preparing to enter into the land of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the land promised to them by God. And the first verses that we read in the Torah portion, Hashem spoke to Moshe on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall observe a Sabbath rest for Hashem." So the first commandment that we encounter in Parashat Behar, after the whole sequence of the book of Leviticus dealing with such minute details of the service in the tabernacle, service that was to become the service of the Holy Temple, the first commandment now that we encounter is that of the cycle of the Sabbatical and Jubilee years, the Shemitah and the Yovel. An issue is made by our sages of this verse and the connection between the concept of Shemitah, the Sabbatical year, and Mount Sinai. Our sages state, what is the connection between Sinai and Shemitah, that this mitzvah, as it were, this commandment has been singled out of all of the commandments that were given at Mount Sinai. After all, the whole Torah was given at Mount Sinai, but yet Parashat Behar begins, Hashem speaking to Moshe on Mount Sinai, saying, when you come into the land shall observe a Sabbath rest for me. And the most conventional wisdom of our sages states that this indicates to us that just as the whole Torah, just as the concept of Shemitah was given with all of its particulars and all of its very specific details at Mount Sinai, so too the entire Torah was given at Mount Sinai. But on a deeper and yet simpler level, why was this mitzvah chosen, as it were, as the showcase to demonstrate the process of the transmission and the giving of all of the Torah in all of its great detail for observance at Mount Sinai? What is so singular about the commandment of the Shemitah, of the sabbatical year? So maybe it's more deeply connected to the very essence of what the Sinai experience was, because after all, the Sinai experience can be defined as the greatest encounter between the Almighty and man that ever took place. And it was a one-time experience for Israel. But clearly, consistently, the Torah's goal is for everyday life for Israel to be a continuation of that level of intimacy and revelation and excitement and attachment to God. And so we can understand on a deeper level, and yet a simpler level, why is Sinai mentioned? Because this is the connection between Sinai and the sabbatical year and the Jubilee cycle. It's very clear. The people are now getting ready to come into the land of Israel, and God has a love affair with the people of Israel and the land of Israel. As the verse here states, the land is mine, for you are sojourners and residents with me. So, going into the land now and preparing to live the life of obeying God and following His commands and honoring the land and giving the land its rest and living within the land now becomes the extension into permanent reality of the Sinai experience. Living in the land, observing its rest cycle, is a way of perpetuating the Sinai thunder. And that thunder resounding with the sound of God proclaiming, "I am here," which was the core essence of the experience of Mount Sinai. The truth is that in everyday reality, there's no greater sign of His presence and connection with His people than their living with reverence in His land. But still, Shemitah is a great secret. And even when we can see it as a physical continuation of the intimacy of Mount Sinai, because it's just such a living example of the reality of a constant connection to God, it's even deeper still. It's almost unspeakable if we really were to fathom the implication of the connection between Israel and her land and the sabbatical year. Because really, herein lies one of the greatest keys to understanding the relationship between the people of Israel and her land. And we can see this very clearly when we study the sequence of the verses in our Parsha, and we consider the words of the Midrash in the ancient Tanchuma Midrash, because none of the verses in the Torah are coincidental in their placement. So we begin with Hashem's command, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall observe a Sabbath rest for Hashem. And of course this is followed by the Jubilee cycle. But if the Sabbatical and Jubilee cycles are not observed, what will happen? In the end, one is forced to sell one's possessions, as verse 14 states, when you make a sale to your fellow. And if that is taken as a warning, if that is taken properly, then one will change his attitude and return to Hashem and keep the Shemitah properly, and then it will be good. But if not, he'll be forced to sell his field, as verse 25 states, if your brother becomes impoverished and sells part of his ancestral heritage. And again, if the message is taken to heart, all will be well. But if not, eventually he'll have to sell his very home. Verse 29 indicates, if a man shall sell a residence house in a walled city. And here again, it's all about recognition, cognizance, free choice, and making a decision. If he returns to Hashem and honors the land, fine. But if not, he'll be reduced to utter poverty. As verse 35 tells us, if your brother becomes impoverished with you and his means falter. And once again, this is a means of calling back this person to Hashem. If he gets the message, situation can be repaired. And if not, verse 39 indicates he will be sold into servitude. As it is written, if your brother becomes impoverished with you and is sold to you. But finally, the end of the cycle is that he will be sold to foreigners. As it states in verse 47, if the means of a sojourner who resides with you shall become sufficient, and your brother becomes impoverished with him, and he is sold to an alien who resides with you. And, concludes the Midrash, not only him, not only the individual, but all of Israel. All of Israel is sold off to the foreigners. And thus we find in the days of Jeremiah that because they desecrated the sabbatical years, they were sold to the nations. And here we see in Chronicles 2, towards the very end. So he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men by the sword in their sanctuary. He had no pity on lad or maiden, nor on elderly and aged men. God delivered everyone into his hand. All the articles of the temple of God, large and small, the treasures of the temple of Hashem and the treasures of the king and his officers, he brought everything to Babylonia. They burned the temple of God, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, and burned down all its palaces and destroyed all its precious articles. Those who survived the sword he exiled to Babylonia, where they became slaves to him and his sons, until the kingdom of Persia began to reign. This was in fulfillment of the word of Hashem spoken by Jeremiah, until the land would be appeased of its sabbatical years. All the years of its desolation it rested, to the completion of 70 years. Now, of course, the Midrash continues and makes it clear and consoles us and tells us that even in this sad state, the Shekhinah is with them. But don't we find here the secret to that which we so fervently seek, the key to Jewish sovereignty, security, and prosperity in the land is the observance of the Sabbatical and Jubilee years. As the Torah here states in Parashat Behar, "For the land is mine, and you are sojourners and residents with me."